Hello, I'm Dr. Lane Favar, and again, welcome back to Current World Problems here at Central Christian College in McPherson, Kansas. I'm just going to take a moment today, just real briefly, talk a little bit about cultures and how culture interacts. Part of your coursework this week was dealing with the issue of like the rights, human rights, and so on. We're talking a little bit about cultures and what are cultures. So I want to take a moment to give some perspective on that. And actually, I'm going to be pulling from some material by a gentleman named Dean Borgman, and it's actually it's kind of odd, a youth ministry book, but he does a great job talking about culture, and he's actually quoting from Kenneth Roberts, so I'm going to be borrowing from their material here for just a little bit. Basically what I want to talk about is what happens when cultures have to interact with one another. You know, look, you could take this easy. Let's go back to high school for just a moment. Back when some of us were in high school, cultures interacted. You know, you had the preppy guys and the athletes and the nerdy people, and you know, I don't know what was going on in your school, but those are all examples of culture. And you all have to live in this building, and you all have to get along with one another as you're in this one building. Well, that just continued on from there. You know, you go to work, you have different cultures. We live in here, at least I do here in the United States of America. We have all these different cultures who are interacting. But now we're talking about globalization, where all of these cultures have to interact with one another. And so what happens when you put cultures together? And how do they interact with one another? So let's define 4 different types of culture, and I think this will help you as we begin to understand how cultures interact. The first is called dominant culture. And again, forgive me for my handwriting. My students tell me all the time, what are you writing? Is this a Greek class or what is this? So anyway, it says dominant culture. And dominant culture, basically it's kind of the culture that's in control. It's the dominant culture. Basically, it's the idea that culture, as culture continues, each generation passes down certain cultural realities from one generation to another. And this is the one that's most widely accepted within, whether it's an institution or within a state or a country or the global perspective. What is the dominant culture? Usually they're the ones that have economic and political control. So they're the ones generating income, controlling the income. They kind of give political direction to what's going on. You know, kind of like what's happening now. We're talking about current world problems. In some ways, the United States and the USSR, you go back into the 70s and 80s, and you're dealing with the Cold War and this fight against these 2 dominant cultures, and then the Cold War ended, and there for a while, some people accepted the idea, well, the U.S. is the dominant world culture, and they're the culture that was kind of controlling what was happening. And now we're seeing that kind of slide away as political control tends to become more global. Now, is the United States a dominant global force? That's a big question. Mostly, when you're talking about dominant culture, you're talking about that the values of the dominant culture are accepted pretty widely by everyone. Now, that's another reason why the U.S. is kind of seen as this dominant culture, dominant political culture, because democracy and the idea of democracy, now be careful, because you're supposed to study the difference between democracy and the republic, so be careful. But democracy, this grand idea of democracy, kind of has been accepted worldwide as, okay, this is a good thing. So that's where we get this dominant culture from. Second to that is what we call subcultures. Subcultures. Now, subcultures, these are the cultures or beliefs or values or perspectives that live in conjunction with the dominant culture. They don't try to challenge necessarily the dominant culture, but they try to negotiate how to exist within the dominant culture. You know, here in America, it could be like the Republicans and the Democrats. 2 different perspectives. Now they both agree somewhat on the dominant cultural values, freedom and so on, but each has their own perspectives of that, and they want to hold to those perspectives, and so they create what's called a subculture. Yes, I'm an American, but I'm a Democrat, or yes, I'm an American, but I'm a Republican. And that's kind of the subculture. Sometimes religious faith can be a subculture. Think about within Christianity, all the different denominations that exist and so on. Those are good examples of subculture. Christianity being the dominant culture and the subcultures underneath that. So, even as we look beyond in the global system, what's that dominant culture? And then how about all these subcultures? We've had to deal with this, in dealing with subcultures in the United States. Talking about African American culture and Latino culture and Asian culture, the melting pot idea. How are all those cultures existing? And some of it's pretty cool because sometimes we get some great things out of it. Rock and roll is a great example. That really came out of the African American culture, was picked up within the dominant culture, and then ran into this great idea called rock and roll. So that's a neat way that happens. Now, again, the subculture, they're not all that hyped on actually changing things as long as their ideas and thoughts are reflected in society and accepted. They're okay existing there. It does make things interesting though. Like how about happy holidays? We come into December and now you've got Hanukkah and you've got Christmas and you've got Kwanzaa and who knows whatever else is coming up. But those are all great examples of how the subculture exists in relationship to the dominant culture. Now there's two others. This one is called contra culture. It's called contra culture. And contra cultures, they exist within the dominant culture. Really, they're their own subculture, but they're not out necessarily to change anything. They just want to complain about everything. It's as though they exist just because I just need something to be upset about. So they don't seek to necessarily change things in the political system. They just want to cause problems. So truancy, some kind of vandalism. Those are the types of things that people in a contra culture do. Anarchy. Because if you think about it, if anarchy won, what will we have? It's such an interesting question. Anarchists tend to just fight against whoever's in control because somebody's in control. And so that would be a great example of a contra culture. It doesn't matter if anyone is dominant, they need to be fought against. Actually, you might find some of the roots in this in Marxist type philosophy of politics. Just fight against whoever's in control so that we can evolve as a human race. Is one way to look at that. The other one that's closely related to this is called counterculture. Counterculture. Here we go beyond the idea, at least as Borman says, beyond the idea of defiance and actually seeking to change things. So sometimes you have a subculture that says, you know what, we've had enough. And we want to change things. We want to upset the fruit basket. And so really what happens is that subculture becomes a counterculture. And they seek to change the values. They upset the values. They try to redefine the values. They need to seek new leadership and so on. And we see that. Here in the States right now, we constantly see this kind of thing happening where a subculture rises up and begins a counterculture movement. As you talk about families, how are families defined in the world today? There's all different ways. Here in America, at least for a while, it tended to be the dominant culture said a man and a woman and 2.5 kids. Still trying to figure out the 0.5 part. But that's a family. Well, now we have a subculture who's begun to say, let's stop just complaining about it. Let's stop being just a contra-culture and actually become a counterculture. And so you're seeing that happen where family is kind of being redefined within the United States. And now I say all this because I want to get back to that issue that you guys studied about this week. Between the issue of a democracy and a republic. What are the differences? Because one of the questions that we have to wrestle with, dominant culture, subculture, contra-culture, counterculture, how much does culture get to decide who we are and what we are? It's a pretty serious issue as you study about world problems. Who gets to do it? Because if it's by majority vote, which is what democracy really is, majority vote, which is not what our founding fathers put together. They put together a republic, as you studied about. When the counterculture gets big enough and they can vote, they can change the dominant culture. Is that the way that should happen? See, that's a serious, especially when we deal with biblical worldview and biblical values. What happens when the majority overrides what it is that God has kind of put forth to guide us as a healthy culture and a healthy community and a healthy society? So this week I want you to think about that. This is just one way to look at it, what happens as cultures come together. And understanding too that sometimes there's things like assimilation. That's one of the things I think you read about this week. Like example of rock and roll, you know, the two cultures bring the best of both cultures together to become a more enriching culture. Well, yeah, that makes sense, and that's good. And we need to be looking at ways. How are ways more that I can, I get to know people of other cultures. What are the rich heritage that they bring? What are the things I can take out of it? That's important for us to look at. But beyond that is this idea of what do we do? How does culture change? How does culture grow? And do we allow it to just be a majority vote with a democratic type rule, or do we follow the idea of the republic where we lay down these laws, these ideals, and then the government's job is not to seek majority vote, but to seek the enforcement of what a just society is? Wrestle with that. If you want to have some discussion with your facilitator, I'll ask the facilitator to open up a threaded discussion about that and see what ideas you can come out with. So anyway, thanks again. You take care. We're continuing to pray for you as you make your way through current world problems.